Man, am I excited to introduce our next guest today as part of our Thrive Through Connection series. Christian's a very good friend of mine. He is a co-founder of Visible. He currently is a co-founder and partner at High Alpha. For those of you that do not know, High Alpha is a venture studio that conceives, launches, and scales technology companies. Christian's a founder himself. Before he founded Studio Science, a leading design and innovation consultancy based in Indianapolis. Christian's also an active angel investor, founder himself, started co-founded a venture fund called Gravity Ventures. Also serves on a lot of boards, Visible being included. Uh, been married to his wife Brandy for 23 years. You have six kids, and you're passionate about all things faith, entrepreneurship, design, conservation, and outdoor Christian. Man, you're a man of many talents.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
I think we're gonna really love spending 45 minutes with you here, and I would love just to first talk about storytelling. I think it's one of the things that you instilled in me early on, Christian, as you were mentoring me throughout the years. And I think it's an incredibly important tool. But just to hear from you, like, how does storytelling fit into the day-to-day role of a founder?
Yeah, I I think storytelling is this will be my first kind of controversial hot take is probably like the most important skill uh, a leader of any type needs to possess, whether they be CEO of an early stage venture backed startup, a public company, or a nonprofit. You know, when you think about, I mean, the word storytelling has these kind of woo woo, soft, qualitative uh, kind of associations. Um, you know, when you even hear the word storytelling, you think about somebody who can tell a good joke or spin a yarn. But when you think about like what is a CEO, what is the leader of an early stage company like responsible for? Like what are the most important things that don't get delegated, right? They are setting and relentlessly communicating the vision and strategy of the company. That's the CEO's job. Uh, Recruiting and retaining the absolute best talent into the enterprise, and making sure the company doesn't run out of money. Like those, if I had to encapsulate, like what are the top three immutable, non delegatable functions of a CEO? It's those three things. Well, what is part and parcel to all three of those things, right? Crafting and communicating strategy and vision, that is storytelling. Recruiting and retaining the best talent, it is driven by your ability to tell a story, to invite people onto a winsome, attractive, compelling journey, right? One that's going to be very difficult and statistically speaking is likely to fail, right? So that requires the ability to craft a pretty compelling narrative and then not running out of money. So when you're whether you're talking to the loan officer at the bank, or the decision maker at a private credit organization or a VC, what are they really buying? And I would say that this is really true at all stages of the business. We tend to think that maybe storytelling is more important in the very beginning when there's nothing of substance in the business other than vision. But look at a public company CEO, CFO, executive team, you know, what is an earnings call, right? It's not just a readout. It is an exercise in storytelling. You look at a S1 prior to an IPO. What is that? A big piece of that is storytelling, the ability to craft and deliver a a really compelling narrative.
What about team? Like, how does this fit into team? So clearly, it's important for founders. As founders evolve and their companies grow, scales and grows, can you recount where you are working with founders or their teams and also giving leadership team storytelling tools and how do you see that evolving with the companies you've worked with?
Well, I think that there's exceptions to every rule, right? There are exceptions to this, but they're usually exceptions that prove the rule. The people that get furthest in life, professionally, relationally, tend to be good storytellers, right? And in many ways, storytelling is closely related to selling. Maybe it should be called story selling instead of storytelling, um, because the best ideas don't win. You know this, Mike. The best products don't necessarily win. One thing that I think is common amongst companies, products, businesses, cities, nation states that thrive is uh, the ability for those organizations to tell stories institutionally. So it starts with the CEO. The CEO should be masterful at it. Um, but when things are really working, you'll find that no matter who you talk to inside of a company, they're able to tell a story, and they're able to tell a story about the company. And at the executive team level or at the managerial level, in a way, all those people are mini CEOs running their lines of businesses. And so the need to be able to deliver winsome, interesting narratives about why a customer should care, or why an investor should care, or why someone should, you know, choose to join your enterprise. Um, it's really important at every level in the organization. And in some ways, you could think of storytelling as thinking. So it's not just the ability to keep people's rapt attention, although that certainly is part and parcel to it. But in many ways, a good storyteller tends to be a good thinker, in the same way that a good writer tends to be a good thinker. Those are also very tightly coupled. When I'm there's a few like intangibles I look for when hiring. Um, some of them easier to quantify than others, but I would say my top three, aside from intelligence and grit and pedigree and experience and all the stuff you can kind of parse from LinkedIn, it's curiosity, um, which I probably don't need to explain why I think that's important in terms of people's ability to be self-directed and to learn and to be internally motivated to learn. The second one is taste, which we could do a separate podcast on that someday. That's one of my favorite things to talk about. And the third is storytelling. If somebody is like insatiably curious, has very good taste, which is actually a proxy for judgment, somebody who has very good judgment, and somebody's an extraordinarily good communicator, seller, storyteller, man, those three things in concert, that's a powerful combination.
I'm going to go off script for a second. How do you test for storytelling? You said you mentioned with just use hiring, right? Which is a little bit different than funding. How because inherently funding is storytelling is kind of baked into that process, or should be.
Yeah, yeah.
With hiring, like how do you test for that with people you're hiring?
Well, I mean, it's not very complicated, and I mean, Mike, you meet new people all the time. You're in a enviable position in that Visible has well over 1,000 customers. You've spoken to the vast majority of them, so you're in rooms or on Zoom calls or phone calls with new people every day, and pretty quickly, like, is this somebody that um, is this a compelling personality that I'm interacting with? Do I know this call is going to go 30 minutes over, or am I going to be looking for a way to get off this call 20 minutes early? And I think in large part, um, it's people's ability to capture and hold your attention again, which is storytelling. I ask a lot of questions in interviews. Like one of my jobs, obviously, is just assessing the talent and prospects for success of founders, like yourself. And I have a little battery of questions I tend to ask them that are maybe a little outside of the norm. One that I ask is, well, first of all, it's important to understand, like, the way you get good at anything is practice. And the way you get good at building a business is practicing building a business. The way you get good at making money is practicing making money. The way you get good at being kind is to practice being kind, right? So whatever it is you want to get good at, you ain't going to get good at it unless you practice it. And when it comes to entrepreneurship, the way you get good at it is practicing it. So I'll oftentimes ask founders, hey, tell me tell me a story of the first time you remember making money for yourself. Like not when you were a hostess at TGI Fridays, but if you rewind the tape, like what's the first memory you have of making money? Now that might sound like a vulgar question, but it's actually like an excellent way to excellent shorthand question to get to a better understanding of how much practice that individual has in entrepreneurship. And all great entrepreneurs, the vast majority of great entrepreneurs, all tell some version of the same story. Now, they don't all tell it necessarily well, but they all tell some story, some version of the same story. Oh, Christian, yeah. So let's see. In third grade, I got sent to the principal's office because I was buying lemon heads at 7-Eleven and marking them up 100% and selling them on the playground. And in middle school, I started a lawn mowing business. But by the end of the summer, I had four of my friends actually doing the lawn mowing, and I was just doing marketing and knocking on doors. And in high school, I started a screen printing company. There's there's some version of that story that almost every great founder I've ever met is able to tell. The really good ones are able to tell those stories in a way that you know makes you believe that they are getting better and better and better at the craft of entrepreneurship. So if somebody just rattled through that list without talking about how they got in trouble with the principal and how they talked their way out of it, or how they got permission from their parents to get a hardship license because now they were mowing lawns that were 2 and 3 miles away from their house, too far to be able to, ride their bike while dragging, a lawnmower behind them. So it's just by asking a few simple questions, you can pretty quickly assess if somebody's good at narrative or not.
Yeah. Uh, since you mentioned founders, by nature of being a studio and funding founders, you work with a lot of first-time founders. What are the common mistakes you see related to storytelling? And is there anything you have a specialty in SaaS at High Alpha? Is there anything um, that relates to SaaS as well and storytelling mistakes?
Well, yeah. So I would say the first mistake or a mistake that founders often make is not not working on improving their storytelling skills. So, and you'll see this a lot. It might be a very promising business. The business might be working. You're having kind of early conversations with the founder, and there's a fine balance between leaning on your team and making sure that they get airtime and making sure that you're surrounding yourself with people who are better than you in whatever discipline it is you've hired them for inside of your business, but an over reliance on other people to tell the story, right? So I see that kind of fairly frequently. You might be asking a question about um, what creative approaches the enterprise is taking around demand generation, and the CEO might say, "Oh, well, you know what? I really need to get Barbara on the line. She runs that, et cetera, et cetera." Now, it's good if you don't have the answer to the question, it's good to go find the answer to that question. But as CEO, especially an early stage company where your fingerprint should be all over the entire enterprise, an over reliance, kind of outsourcing storytelling to other people on your team. And and the way you get good at it, as we talked about at the onset of this conversation, is you got to practice it, right? You've got to get a lot of reps. And I think there are there are lots of people who say, I'm just not good at that, right? I'm good at this. I'm a product genius, but I'm not good at storytelling. So I'm going to defer to our CMO as an example and outsource how vision and strategy is articulated and disseminated. And I think that's a mistake. I also think sometimes there's an over reliance on letting the data tell the story, and data is a huge part of storytelling, but you can't solely rely on the numbers to do that for you. I mean, you want to be able to harmonize the quantifiable with the qualitative, and that's part of the mastery of learning to be able to tell good stories. Now you mentioned, is there anything peculiar or specific to SaaS businesses? And maybe I'm taking this a different direction than you intended, but storytelling is not limited to the words that come out of your mouth, or the sentences you put down on a piece of paper. Everything in your business, every touch point, every piece of surface area, every experience is either adding to your narrative in a positive way, or it is detracting from your story in a negative way. For a SaaS business, in many cases, especially if it's a SMB, PLG oriented motion, your product is going to need to be able to tell a story. And I don't think that most founders think of it that way. If you think about brand, storytelling, customer experience, product design, these are all nodes on one continuum, one narrative continuum that is informing in the mind of your consumer, your customer, your prospect, like what it is you do and why they should care. So one thing I would encourage founders to think about is to break out of the idea that storytelling is just practicing in front of a mirror, like with the words that are coming out of your mouth, and thinking more critically about how you engineer story into every aspect of your business, in particular your product.
Where does brand fit into that? Like story, brand, product. Like is brand part of story? Is story part of brand? Like we talk about brand in our product, but like you're a brand expert in my opinion. Like how do you think where does brand fit into that equation?
Yeah, I mean, you could, I guess like one technical definition of the word brand would be um, the the space that your product or service holds in the mind of your customer, right? Which is not a particularly like useful definition, but it's useful in that it at least allows you to think expansively around what brand and what storytelling are. That you asked like what's the distinction? Um, I'm not sure there's much of one, quite frankly. There's this idea of like customer experience, um, brand, and product. And um, at the end of the day, and this is probably more true for a software company than any other company, those things are inextricably linked. I would argue that there's a pretty big delta between the brand of Coca-Cola, the hundreds of millions of dollars spent on out-of-home marketing and advertising and packaging design and display design, and the actual 140 calorie brown sugar water that's in the can, right? Like almost all of the value of Coke is tied to memories and future experiences and consistency, et cetera. With a SaaS product, there's no way to make a crisp delineation between the experience your customer has using your product and your brand, because most SaaS companies, especially like young, more thinly capitalized early stage companies, aren't buying Super Bowl ads. You know what I mean? They're not, and you're not going to see a whole lot of ads around bus stops or billboards. There's obviously some exceptions to that if you spend much time in the Bay Area, but as a general rule, so we could get cute around defining like the literal denotation of all of those words, but I think it's probably a good practice to think of brand and story and product experience as one collective whole.
You mentioned practice being a key component of getting better at storytelling and refining the craft of storytelling. Outside of practice, are there any frameworks or rituals you would recommend to a founder? Like, hey, it's not core to what I am great at, but I want to get great at it. Outside of practice, what else can I do? Like, is there any resources that come to mind or frameworks that you would recommend?
I don't know about frameworks. There's a really good book. There's lots of books on storytelling. I mean, so go to Amazon, put it in the search bar, and pick the one with the cover that speaks to you the most. But there's a really great book called Good in a Room, which I would highly recommend to anyone who, as we all should think this, who thinks that they need to improve in their ability to tell stories and connect with audiences. It's called Good in a Room. It's excellent. Um, there is. the the most important piece of advice I would say is reps. And I know that that may like be an unsatisfying answer, but it's like the most important thing, practice. So getting up in front of the room, speaking at the conference, fighting for some airtime in the boardroom. And again, good entrepreneurs kind of get this innately. Like one thing about really good entrepreneurs, and I realize that's like a subjective frame I'm putting around this, but what I mean by that is individuals who have the potential to build amazing businesses. Doesn't mean that they're always going to do it, but the ones that innately are kind of wired to be able to do that. One interesting thing about them is that they tend to be really boring. And what I mean by that is we have this idea, this exemplar, the platonic ideal of the intrepid entrepreneur is Steve Jobs, right? Um, and he's got it all. He's got taste, he's got curiosity, or had it all, and was a great storyteller. And we think of them as being high charisma, dynamic, the reality distortion field, all the things that we say about Jobs. And today maybe that's Musk or Palmer Luckey or whoever the second coming of Steve Jobs is. But I've gotten to know a lot of founders over the years. To say thousands would not be an exaggeration. And one thing that kind of strikes me is most of them are not like Steve Jobs, and very successful and not like Steve Jobs. In a way, they're quite boring. And what I mean by that is if you sit next to them at a cocktail party or a dinner party, their range of experiences and interests and things that they want to talk about, you'll find to be quite limited. What a really good entrepreneur wants to talk about is what they're working on, period. Right. And because of that, the good ones naturally get a lot of experience talking about it. So it is, I can tell you to go practice, but the reality is, I think it's probably more correlated than
Mm.
causal, and that good founders are always telling the story about their baby. They're always selling. They're always story selling. I'm going to write a book called Story Selling. This is an excellent
Well, I already wrote my
idea.
LinkedIn post in my head when we were talking, so
Yeah, yeah.
you
This
can
is
take
this
it.
is we've just come up with something interesting. But so I can tell you to go practice, but the truth of the matter is, like, good founders are always telling their story. They're always refining their story. Um, they're always iterating and experimenting with new and different ways to elicit the reaction that they want to elicit.
Want, but I'm curious, like any founders in the high alpha portfolio that you think are nailing it right now in terms of storytelling. I'm listening to this. I'm like, oh man, I want to go get some inspiration. Anyone that come to mind?
Um, yeah, yeah. I mean, I could think of a lot, and I think some of them that you probably know very well, but um, I think Max Yoder, who you and I both know very, very well, the former CEO and founder of Lessonly, was an extraordinary storyteller, and I think that's probably less of an opinion at this point and more of a fact. And his ability to connect kind of missionally what he wanted to accomplish, his own purpose as an individual, and weave that in as thickly as he did to the mission and vision and strategy of Lessonly. I wouldn't necessarily say it was unparalleled, but I would say he was expert at it, and it was hard to walk out of a room with him, whether he was speaking at a conference, or you were in a board meeting, or you were sitting in his backyard. Um, he was able to always come back to the why, like why he cared so much about this business, um, how he was able to invite so many other people, and not just employees and staff people, but like customers and trading partners along on the journey. And if you look at like the total enterprise value of the company at the time it sold to Seismic, certainly the company was ripping, and at that point it was like a real company operating at scale. but I would venture to guess that a large part of the enterprise value of that company at acquisition could be attributed to Max's ability to inspire. And he did that predominantly through the lens of storytelling and writing. Um, I would also maybe a more recent example would be we founded a company called Luster, which is in the kind of AI driven sales training space with a really talented entrepreneur named Christina. And I don't know if you drop links in on your podcast or not, but go look her up on LinkedIn or YouTube and watch the way the missional zeal with which she talks about why she was put on this planet. It was to start this company, Luster, and much in the same vein as Max and Lessonly, who was really focused on helping people do better work. Christina is singularly focused on helping sales professionals get better at their craft. And you know, I think part of being good at storytelling is to be credible and believable and authentic for people to know that they're not being sold to. Um, there's a there's a quote that I heard in a documentary I watched recently on Aaron Rodgers, and it was kind of a throwaway quote, I think, in the documentary, but it really like pierced me. He said that hope is a memory of the future. And if you really like sit with that idea for a few minutes, it's a powerful idea. So again, we tend to think of hope as like, well, if everything goes my way and the wind's at my back and the sun's shining, maybe this will work out. That quote by Aaron, "Hope is a memory of the future," really reframes it. It basically uh, it's basically saying this is happening. It just hasn't happened yet, right? And I think that when you're doing kind of the evangelistic sale, um, the evangelistic narrative, when you're inviting people onto a journey and they need, they're staking their careers, their families, their futures on on what you're telling them. Everyone involved in that needs to believe with a high level of like expectancy that this is going to happen. And I think Christina does a really really nice job of that.
Love that. I want to switch gears slightly here to some pretty tactical things for founders because we're storytelling is directly related to fundraising. Christian, I
Yep.
think you're an expert with design and decks and I think this is somewhat related here in helping our founders in our community get better at fundraising. So you have an incredible background in design. How much weight do you place on visual storytelling uh, in relation to the company and in this case the pitch deck? How does that fit into when you're evaluating a
Yeah.
potential investment? You
Well, I
mentioned
mean,
taste.
as you might imagine, I put a great deal of weight on it, but maybe not in the way that most people think. I mean, I'd maybe make two comments, Mike. The first one is that great design will not save a bad idea. Okay. It might allow it to hang around the hoop longer than its expiration date, but putting lipstick on a pig, it's still a pig at the end of the day. So it is an accelerant for great ideas, but it is not a savior for bad ideas. So I'd like to just start by saying that, like, if you don't have your house in order, like the fundamentals, um, no amount of paint is going to fix that. I tend to think of design as like there's two forms of design. There's capital D design and lowercase d design. I like to focus more on like capital D design, which transcends aesthetics, right? So I have backed as many, if not more, founders who had very bad lowercase d design. Think of that as like the aesthetics or the on trend visualization of data or whatever's in vogue that quarter. And as opposed to like capital D design, which means that they are able to communicate clearly and effectively visually, right? So they might be, the design itself might not impress anybody at Parsons or the Savannah School of Art and Design, but the audience is able to clearly intuit the story that's being told. I mean, some of the best businesses and the most compelling decks I've ever seen um, never had a professional designer touch them, right? But the storytelling, the cadence, the plot, because at the end of the day, this is all about plot, setting up an antagonist, introducing the protagonist, pointing toward the climax and the resolution and the denouement and who is the hero. Those are all kind of plot and storytelling conventions that can be augmented and enhanced with amazing design. Um, but amazing design in a vacuum, I think is really, really insufficient. There's I actually get a bit suspicious if, and we're talking about decks here. This
Sure.
transcends decks, but in decks in particular, I get a little suspicious if something is overly lowercase d designed. I mean, what are they trying to conceal? What are they trying to distract from? And it doesn't mean necessarily that's the intention, but it's a thought that I frequently have. There's this balance where you want high quality information and a high level of fidelity, and you want it to be smart and considered and express taste, because as I mentioned earlier, taste is just a proxy for good judgment, and you want founders and CEOs to have extraordinarily good judgment. But if it's overdone, if it's overcooked, if it's too baroque, um, it oftentimes forces me to try to look for the truth beneath the truth, and many times
Hmm.
what I find is not good.
Is there a common? Now I'm just curious. Like, is there a common thing you find across the overly designed lowercase d decks? Is it like traction? Is it the product, or there's just some sort of red flag?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of metaphors I could probably invoke. Uh, some makeup can be wonderful on a human being's face and can accentuate natural beauty and draw attention to you know physical traits that are beautiful and attractive. And then the kind of we've all seen that taken too far, right,
Hmm.
where there's so much makeup that it invites the question, what is being concealed here? So I couldn't point to a specific
Sure.
design convention, um, because that changes all the time. And by the way, I've also seen amazing businesses with like exemplary design where they nailed everything and got it right and let's go. So I'm using this more as
Sure.
just there is a point where something can be overdone, over designed, and it can invite a level of skepticism that could have been avoided.
Okay. Great. Love that. Um, Fundraising, especially right now, takes months in today's market. I'd say for the typical founder, right? Any advice you give to founders to keep their story consistent, but also, you know, as I'm gathering feedback, practicing, refining my pitch, like how can I be
Mm.
adaptable?
You want to be really discerning as you're getting feedback in the fundraising process, because if you go talk to 100 investors, you're going to get 100 opinions. Yes, there'll be some commonality with some of them, but I've seen a lot of founders walk out of their 50th pitch meeting and it's total whiplash, right? Because the last investor they just talked to told them the market's not big enough. The next investor they're going to meet with tells them that total addressable market doesn't matter because if it's sufficiently disruptive, it's impossible to size the market. Take that slide out of the deck. I don't care about TAM as an example. So you've got to be really discerning. You want to you want to collect all the input, you want to process all that input, you want to triangulate and look for overlapping patterns. And hey, I've heard this 37 times in the past 4 weeks. I probably should pay attention to it. And you want to integrate some of that, and you want to be iterative. I mean, you talk to any founder, they're going to tell you their 100th pitch was a heck of a lot better than their first pitch. And that's a function of a repetition, which we've already talked about. But equally important, it's probably because they learned a lot in the process. They learned a lot about what the market's looking for. Um, but with all that said, um, I think it's Mike Maples Jr. that says a startup is a disagreement with, does he say a disagreement with the future or no, a disagreement with the present. Um, and so if you're on to something that is sufficiently innovative and sufficiently disruptive, you are not, that is not going to engender a lot of consensus attaboys, right? You're going to have a lot of people telling you change this, change that, and on and on and on. And if you do that, you're going to end up um, very mediocre. You may get funded, which I guess is good on one hand, but your business is likely to be very, very mediocre. You can't design and launch and scale a startup by committee. It just doesn't happen, right? So my advice would be keep your antenna up, have a very open heart and an open mind, listen, um, but really work on being discerning in terms of what you integrate and iterate on, because there's only one person on the planet that really knows what you want to build. There's only one person on the planet that really knows what your vision of the future is, and that's you, right? So it's a tough balance to be both very open to feedback and open to integrating some of that, while also sticking by your guns, sticking to your knittings, whatever metaphor you want to use, and not compromising on what makes your business unique and special.
We talked about uh, some of the formulaic process of storytelling, and there's protagonist and antagonist, the denouement, um, which is kind of like a formula, if you will.
Yep.
We love talking about trends at Visible. Like, what's one trend you see fading in the deck, and you're glad it's kind of fading? Is it like you mentioned Tam? Is Tam? I'm not sure if it is or not.
Tam's a good Tam.
Yeah.
Tam's a good one. I mean, um, I just again, it kind of depends on the stage of this is no advice is universal advice when it comes to uh, you know preparing to hit the road and raise money from investors. So this is not gospel, but I would say um, the attempts to kind of quantify the market, specifically if you're legitimately disrupting an industry or attempting to disrupt an incumbent or change the way that the world works or work happens, it's a little silly to think in terms of, well, Gartner or McKinsey put out this report and said this is how much is spent on this market per annum, and its CAGR is 17%, and by 2035 this is going to be a $30 billion industry, because we just don't know. I think it's good to have a rational answer to the question of how big could this be. Like you need to have thought through that. There's no question. But again, I'm very suspicious of the slide with the three circles, the one that says 100 billion TAM, and the one on the right that says 9 billion SAM. And oh, okay, so if we just get 1% of this market, et cetera, et cetera. I think becoming it's not very valuable to the investor, because a good investor is doing their own work. They're building they're bringing their own opinions to what's the market look like today and how is that market going to be shaped over time. So to me, what I usually tell founders is you should have something that approximates a TAM slide, and it should live in the appendix, right? It should not be the fulcrum upon which your story, pivots. Now, on the other side of the table, I would say a kind of non-negotiable for me assuming we're past the idea stage, is I want to see the product. And I'm
Mm.
stunned at how often I see a deck, either real-time presentation or an async presentation that's winds up in my inbox, and there's little to no exposition around the product. In a perfect world, I want to see a demo, right? I want to see live fire, real product. I realize that based on where you are in the maturation of your business, product may not exist yet. That's okay. Show me, show me some mock-ups, show me some prototypes. Prove to me that you have great taste and great product instincts, and that you're able to think empathetically about your customers and prospects and end users. And the best way to do that is for me as an investor to have some level of interaction with the product, which is where the rubber meets the road with the market that you're trying to serve. And Mike, it's amazing to me how often I'll see decks that maybe has one slide on the product, maybe it's a fuzzy little screenshot. Um, I think that's an issue. Um, that is
Is
like,
that recent?
re-
That's interesting to me. Is that a recent trend, or is that something that's always been there?
I think
That's
it's I think it's always been there. I think you definitely see more. I think founders are being conditioned when they're able to, when the product is sufficiently mature to do demos and live fire pitches like that. You see that with, some level of regularity. I'd say that's the default, quite frankly. But you would be surprised how often, like, when with 10 minutes left in the pitch, I'm like, hey, could we see a demo? Could we hop in the product? And the founder will be like, oh, sure, happy to do that, right? But it wasn't, they weren't even
mm,
thinking about that because they were trying to get through. This is how big the market is. This is the next person that I'm going to hire. This is what the pipeline looks like. They've been indoctrinated that there's this 12-step process to the perfect pitch. And frankly, it can be nerve-wracking to demo, live software. But my admonition, my encouragement to all founders would be, if your product isn't a place where you can demo it, always offer to do that. If you're not there yet, like if the product doesn't exist yet, make sure that there's some meaty part of your presentation, whether live or async, that is unpacking how you're thinking about the product, what your kind of early conception is for how it'll operate, what the edge is, or the innovation is, that the market's going to care about. You'd be stunned, um, how many times I sit through one of these presentations, and that's an afterthought.
yeah, interesting. Uh, we haven't touched on data too much, but it's certainly a data interaction kind of being a couple core parts of fundraising in your deck and in your story. High Alpha had launched or took over the SaaS benchmarks report last year, which gives founders a ton of data. We partnered with High Alpha last year on this, and it's amazing. So we'll make sure to link to that. But like, how should early stage founders use like benchmarks or metrics or data as part of their story? It's a balance. But how should they use that? And then like any benchmarks you think are overlooked as well that founders should be thinking about using or traction metrics.
Yeah. Again, kind of depends on where you're at in the life cycle of business. So, if you're a pre-product startup, um, how you quantify traction is going to look very different than if you're a Series B company that's got a $30 million ARR run rate, and you've kind of built the tooling and the machinery to the point where you can really credibly talk about how the business is instrumented. So that's my first caveat. So, but there's a traction story no matter where you're at in the life cycle of the business. So even if you're just 4 weeks in operating out of your grandmother's basement, you can talk about how many customer discovery calls you're completing a week, how many design partners you've signed up, how many BDRs you have in your hiring pipeline, that as soon as you raise the dollars, you're going to be able to. I got no product, I got no revenue, but I still have a traction story. Like, because what investors are looking for is like momentum and velocity. And if you haven't turned revenue on yet, it doesn't really do any good to talk about gross margins and ARR and net revenue retention. So what can we measure? What can we um, how can we articulate progress and acceleration in the, in the business? For a company that's post revenue, they've turned revenue on. Um, the cast of characters of what matters is always the same, but the order of importance changes more frequently than you might expect. So we care about gross margin. We care about top line revenue growth. What is ARR? We care about net revenue retention. We care about gross revenue retention and new logos. We care about capital efficiency, ARR per employee. Like there's this like battery, call it like 10 things that really matter. But they're not always the same 10 things. 3 or 4 years ago, net revenue retention was king, right? So what makes SaaS the eighth wonder of the world is in many regards net revenue retention, right? That, if you have 100% plus NRR, you're not having to go back out and kill what you eat, every quarter. You're just landing, you're expanding, you're selling new products and services and SKUs, and and you're seeing that even if you never had a new customer ever, revenue keeps growing, right? And we can talk about what best in class NRR looks like relative to the type of business, but that was the kind of KPI du jour for many years. It's still very important. um, with that said, I would say there's been, over the last few years, there's been some shifts. I think with this kind of increased focus on capital efficiency, something like ARR per employee, which I don't ever remember people talking about a lot 5 years ago, is something people talk about a lot because it's like an early warning system for how the company is thinking about growth and capital efficiency and cash management, and with the advent of all the new AI tooling that's come online over the last couple of years, we're seeing that number grow at in some cases, an exponential rate. You've read the stories about companies getting to 5, 10, 50 million in some cases of ARR with, less than a dozen people on their team. That would have been impossible a decade ago. One that, I'm gonna date the value of this podcast because this will probably be irrelevant in 18 to 24 months. But right now, gross revenue retention is arguably the most important metric for a scaling enterprise software company. So, like, are you closing new deals, and are you not hiding a churn or attrition problem with expansion? But are you keeping everybody happy, and are you quickly closing new deals while also expanding within the base? So that's kind of that one's quite fashionable right now. Obviously, for later stage companies, Rule of 40, maybe even EBITDA makes an appearance at some point. We usually don't have that conversation, at the stages we're investing in, but it's something to be mindful of.
I love that. I think we're out of time, Christian, and really appreciate you joining and sharing your thoughts. Think the world of you and how you help founders. Our whole theme this year is thinking through relationships and how those matter. I'm curious. I'm sure there's a lot of relationships
Yeah.
that change your life. So this is a hard question,
Hmm.
but anyone in particular you'd want to shout out a professional relationship that's kind of altered your trajectory?
You know, uh, for the listeners of this podcast, Mike and his team did a great job of assembling some thought starter questions that I could review in advance of the interview. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that out loud or not,
Yeah, of
but
course. Yeah.
um, We did not go through that list in a linear fashion. We did not hit all of those questions, and he threw a bunch of net new zingers in there. But one question that he did surface was that, like, what's one professional relationship that's had a profound impact on my life? And it's interesting. I jotted a few names down, and then as I was driving into the office this morning, a different name popped into my head, and I kind of scratched through what I jotted down. And I would say this even if it wasn't you interviewing me, Mike, but you and I are on the board of Visible with a guy named Kyle Jackson, who I first got to know um, socially. And shortly after I got married 23 years ago, Kyle and his wife Mary Beth were the very first couple friends that my wife Brandy and I made. So it was the first like relationship that we like own had like equity ownership in that was equal. And it was years and years until Kyle and I began to intersect in a professional capacity. Um, and as I was thinking about people that I admire who've really shaped me and my perspective and enriched my life across many dimensions, Kyle would be close to the top of that list. I've learned a lot from him. He's incredibly intelligent and incredibly empathetic and very successful, but he's like the least big shot guy you're ever going to meet. He comes to every conversation with a posture of humility and openness and wanting to learn. And he's just been an incredible encourager to me um, professionally. He's believed in me. I think he's I think he's believed in me during seasons where I didn't believe in myself. He's invested in me financially in material ways, but more importantly, I would say he's invested in me. Um, sometimes you have to borrow courage from other people. That's
Mm,
part of like what being a good friend is. Um, you know, many laudable traits are actually contagious. So um, things like I think wisdom is contagious. Like when you hang out with wise people, I think ambition is contagious, as I like to say, when you hang out with ambitious people. And there have been times where Kyle's confidence in me and vote of confidence in me, both in terms of his resources and his time, have just been a remarkable encouragement. I have no question that I've been able to do things and pursue things and win in various aspects of my life because Kyle was there cheering me on. So maybe that's the one I'll leave you with.
love it. I love it. Uh, Shout out to Kyle. Christian, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate you coming on. We'll see you out there and appreciate you
Yeah, man. It was a pleasure and an honor to join you for this. Thanks for having me on.
for sure.